World War Zero, the forgotten conflicts that shaped the modern world picture. It's a moonless night in 1904, and Japanese warships are slicing through the Pacific like silent predators. Their target, a fleet that's completely unaware death is approaching. You might think I'm talking about Pearl Harbor, but you'd be wrong. This is nearly 40 years earlier. And it's not Americans who are about to get blindsided, it's the Russians. What you're about to discover is the story of World War Zero. A conflict so brutal, so revolutionary, and so consequential that it changed the entire course of history. Yet, most people have never even heard of it. By the time the smoke cleared from this forgotten war, an entire empire would be crippled. A new superpower would emerge from nowhere, and the stage would be set for the most devastating century in human history. Machine guns would mow down thousands in horrific human wave attacks. Naval battles would see entire fleets vanish beneath the waves in mere hours, and revolutionary ideas would spread like wildfire across the globe. This isn't just another war story. This is the birth of the modern world, written in blood and gunpowder. So buckle in, because we're about to dive into 3 interconnected conflicts that rewrote the map of the world and lit the fuse that would eventually explode into the Great War itself. Let's start with Japan in the late 1800s. For centuries, this island nation had been completely cut off from the world, living in splendid isolation. But then came the Meiji Restoration, and suddenly everything changed overnight. Japanese leaders looked around and realized they were living in the Stone Age compared to the Western powers. What happened next was extraordinary. In less than 20 years, Japan transformed itself from a medieval feudal state into a modern industrial powerhouse. They absorbed Western technology, military tactics, and industrial methods at breakneck speed. Foreign observers were absolutely stunned by what they witnessed. One journalist put it perfectly when he said Japan had learned in 2 decades what it had taken the West centuries to master. But here's the thing about rapid transformation. It creates ambition, and Japan's ambition had a very specific target: becoming the dominant power in East Asia. Their first test came against Imperial China in 1894, and they absolutely demolished them. Suddenly, this tiny island nation that nobody had taken seriously was the strongest force in the region. That victory, however, created a massive problem. Russia. Now, the Russian Empire in the 1850s had just suffered a humiliating defeat in the Crimean War. Tsar Nicholas II was desperate to restore Russian prestige, and he looked east for opportunities. The Russians founded a city called Vladivostok, which literally means Lord of the East. They weren't being subtle about their intentions. From the Russian perspective, Japan's sudden rise was unacceptable. They forced Japan to give up strategic territories they'd won from China, then promptly took those same territories for themselves. Russian troops marched into Manchuria and stayed there. To Japanese leaders, this felt like a dagger pointed directly at their heart. Something had to give, and both sides knew it. Japan understood they couldn't face Russia alone, so they did something brilliant. They found the perfect ally. Britain was worried about Russian expansion towards British India. So, in 1902, Japan and Britain formed an alliance that would change everything. If war came, Russia would be completely isolated. By 1904, the tension had reached breaking point. Japan was spending an absolutely staggering 82% of their national budget on the military. They built up an army of 400,000 men, modeled after the Prussian system, with an emphasis on education, leadership, and fanatical patriotism. The Japanese military code was crystal clear about what they expected from their soldiers. The principal duty of soldiers is loyalty to sovereign and country. Remember always, that duty is heavier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather. Meanwhile, their navy was becoming a serious threat. They'd bought state-of-the-art warships from Britain and built up the fourth largest fleet in the world, complete with battleships and battle cruisers that could match anything the Russians had. Speaking of the Russians, their military was an absolute mess. Sure, they had over 1 million men in uniform, but only 150,000 were stationed in the Far East. The vast majority of their conscripts were poorly trained peasants with terrible equipment and, even worse, leadership. The officer corps was still dominated by aristocrats who got their positions through family connections rather than competence. Even their navy was a disaster. Many of the sailors came from landlocked provinces and had never seen the sea before joining up. They complained that their officers didn't even bother to learn their names. The ships themselves were outdated compared to Japan's modern fleet. But here's what made the situation truly dangerous. The Russians did unbelieve Japan would actually dare to attack them. St. Petersburg was convinced of their racial superiority and assumed that any war would only start when they decided to begin one. This arrogance would prove catastrophic. Japanese war planning was meticulous and ruthless. Their strategy was simple but brilliant. Destroy the Russian fleet in a surprise attack, win decisive battles on land, and then force a quick peace settlement before Russia's massive reserves could turn the tide. They knew time was not on their side. Russia had far more men and resources, so Japan needed to win fast. The plan called for landing troops in Korea, pushing north into Manchuria, cutting off the Russian naval base at Port Arthur, and then joining forces for one massive battle that would crush Russian resistance. But for any of this to work, Japan needed control of the seas, and that meant the Russian Pacific Fleet had to be eliminated in one devastating blow. On February 8, 1904, Japan declared war on Russia. But before the declaration even reached St. Petersburg, Japanese destroyers were already racing through the darkness towards Port Arthur. The Russians weren't particularly worried. Their fleet was anchored outside the main harbor with some torpedo nets deployed. But most of the ships weren't even on full alert. Many sailors were ashore in Port Arthur's bars and brothels. There was literally a party happening on the flagship. As the Japanese approached, Admiral Togo knew his battleships were irreplaceable, so he planned a nighttime sneak attack using destroyers armed with torpedoes. 10 Japanese destroyers crept through the darkness towards the unsuspecting Russian ships. At 11:30 p.m., the first wave of destroyers launched their torpedoes from just 650 meters away. Most missed their targets, but 2 slammed into Russian cruisers. The Russians frantically opened fire on the second group of destroyers, forcing them to fire from much further away. One Russian sailor described the moment his battleship was hit. The commander heard the order torpedo defense and rushed to get dressed and on deck. During those 2 minutes, they opened fire. Barely on deck, the commander recognized 2 Japanese torpedo boats and saw a torpedo aiming at the ship. A second later came the explosion. The psychological impact was exactly what the Japanese wanted, even though only a few Russian ships were damaged and all could be repaired. The cautious Russian commanders ordered their entire fleet to stay in port. This gave the Japanese complete freedom to land troops wherever they wanted. Actually, before the Port Arthur attack even happened, the Japanese had already started landing 3,000 troops in Korea at the international port of Kim. 2 Russian warships were watching, but couldn't intervene in a neutral port. Then the Japanese did something that shocked the world. They told the Russian ships they had to leave the harbor or be destroyed. This was a blatant violation of international law, but the Japanese didn't care. The Russians faced impossible odds, but they decided to go down fighting. They hoisted their battle flags, started their band playing, and sailed out to face certain death. A British captain who witnessed the scene was moved by their courage. Here were 694 Russian officers and men going to almost certain death, and yet they had their bands playing and were cheering. About 400 British officers and men felt very sorry for them and admired their pluck in giving battle. The Japanese fleet destroyed both Russian ships in the Battle of Kimopo Bay. The Russian commanders scuttled what was left of their vessels rather than let them fall into enemy hands. So the Russo-Japanese War began at sea, but the decisive action would happen on land. The Japanese First Army landed 42,000 men in Korea and planned to push back 19,000 Russians defending along the Yalu River. The first clashes involved the famous Russian Cossacks, but Japanese observers were not impressed by their fighting ability. One Japanese military translator wrote dismissively, "The Cossack army is an army in name only. In fact, they are nothing more than trick riders. There are several 100,000 Cossacks, but if all of them were to come together, what would they be able to do? They are useless soldiers in a war." The Yalu River was a perfect defensive position, but Russian command was completely disorganized. One general ordered the local commander to retreat if attacked, while another told him to stand and fight. The poor commander chose to stay and fight, which turned out to be a terrible mistake. The Japanese prepared for battle with typical thoroughness. They dug concealed artillery positions and sent scouts disguised as Korean fishermen to study Russian defenses. Meanwhile, the Russians moved around in broad daylight and didn't bother to camouflage their massive artillery pieces. When Japanese engineers started building a bridge in plain sight of Russian guns, the Russians opened fire and gave away all their positions. Japanese counter-battery fire from hidden guns then systematically destroyed the Russian artillery before the main attack even began. The Russians expected the Japanese to attack near the river mouth, where Russian naval guns could support the defense. Instead, the Japanese used what would become their trademark tactic throughout the war. They outflanked the Russian position by crossing the river far from where the enemy expected. The Russian commander thought this was just a diversion and held his main position. This allowed the Japanese 12th Division to capture the high ground and cross the Ai River after fierce fighting. A Japanese captain described the assault. The fierce battle lasted 3 hours. The soldiers, standing in the midst of smoke and bullets, were in high spirits and with a vigor that could never be seen in ordinary training. They chanted military songs in one voice and kept pace as they advanced. With their flank collapsing, the Russians were doomed. On May 1, the Japanese launched a general assault across the Yalu River, drove the Russians from their trenches, and began surrounding the retreating columns. Lacking clear orders and facing artillery fire from the heights, some Russian units simply surrendered. The Battle of the Yalukas, around 2,000 Russian and 900 Japanese lives. More importantly, it opened the door for Japanese landings at Dalny and put the strategic fortress of Port Arthur under threat from the land side. The arrival of Admiral Makarov at Port Arthur briefly gave the Russians hope. He led aggressive naval sorties against the blockading Japanese fleet and seemed to be turning the naval war around. But in April 1904, his flagship hit a Japanese mine and sank with all hands, including the admiral himself. To make matters worse, the Japanese Third Army moved up from Dalny and besieged Port Arthur from the landward side. Japanese commander General Nogi had captured the town in just one day during the Sino-Japanese War. But in 1904, it would be a much tougher nut to crack. The Russians had learned from their earlier defeats and fortified Port Arthur with concrete defenses, barbed wire, machine guns, and hand grenades. The first Japanese assaults were slaughtered. Nogi responded by ordering suicidal human wave attacks called human bullets. In a single assault, the Japanese lost 16,000 men. A Buddhist chaplain described the carnage. Some were missing half their bodies. Some had one arm and one leg removed. Some had their heads torn off with only skin attached, and some had their shoes filled with the flesh of their feet. When burned, they looked like blackened, rotten fish, and you couldn't know whose son or husband they once were. No illustration of the Buddhist hells has ever portrayed such cruelties. The Japanese government desperately tried to hide the scale of losses from their own people. With Port Arthur under siege, the Tsar ordered Admiral Wittgeft to take the Pacific Fleet and make a run for Vladivostok to join the cruiser squadron there. Wittgeft wasn't happy about the order, but on August 10th, the fleet steamed out with 6 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. Admiral Togo's combined fleet was waiting with 4 battleships, 2 cruisers, and smaller vessels. Togo had previously lost 2 battleships to mines, so he was reluctant to take risks, but he couldn't allow the Russian fleets to combine. The Japanese first tried to cross the T, sailing across the front of the Russian column to bring all guns to bear, but ended up chasing the Russians while the 2 fleets exchanged fire. A heavy Russian shell hit Togo's flagship and forced it to withdraw temporarily. Just as the Russians seemed to be escaping, 2 Japanese 12-inch shells smashed into the Russian flagship. Admiral Wittgeft was killed instantly, and the ship's steering jammed, forcing it into a helpless turn. The Russian fleet panicked and lost all formation, but was saved from complete disaster when another battleship charged at the Japanese line. The battered Pacific Fleet limped back to Port Arthur and decided to wait for reinforcements. Those reinforcements were already on their way. The Baltic Fleet had been renamed the Second Pacific Fleet and was beginning an epic 8-month journey around the world. So the Japanese had bottled up the Russian Pacific Fleet and surrounded Port Arthur. The Baltic Fleet was sailing around the world to help, but before it could arrive, the fate of Port Arthur would be decided. Throughout the summer of 1904, a series of battles gradually pushed Russian forces away from Port Arthur towards defensive positions around the Manchurian town of Mukden. Then, in January 1905, Port Arthur finally fell and Japanese artillery sank the Pacific Fleet in the harbor. This string of defeats caused enormous tension among Russian commanders, including a bitter feud between Generals Samsonov and Renning. Their relationship would not improve by the time they commanded opposing sectors at the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914. Ironically, a German military observer watching this campaign was Max Hoch, who would later help defeat both these same Russian generals during the First World War. Japan had won a series of important victories, but at a horrific cost in casualties. Russia's much larger population meant they could replace their losses by sending fresh troops east on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Now that Port Arthur had fallen, 5 Japanese armies could concentrate for the decisive battle their general staff had planned to avoid a long war. Japanese Commander General Oyama knew the Russians were planning a counterattack, so he decided to strike first at Mukden. For the coming battle, the Japanese concentrated 200,000 men, 7,300 cavalry, and 1,000 artillery pieces. The 3 Russian armies had around 275,000 men, 16,000 cavalry, and 1,200 artillery pieces. However, the Japanese had about twice as many machine guns as the Russians. Oyama planned to once again outflank the Russian position and trap them in a pincer movement so they could unescape this time. On February 17th, the Japanese army of the Yalu began moving through the hills on the Russian eastern flank. A strong artillery barrage pinned down the Russian center, and their commander assumed the main Japanese attack was coming from the east. He shifted units across the 100-kilometer front, which weakened his western flank, and it was in the west that the Japanese launched their real attack. General Nogi swung around Mukden to threaten the Russians' lines of retreat. A German military observer recorded the devastating effectiveness of Japanese machine guns in the advance. The Russian fire was silenced, but broke out again whenever the machine gun fire slowed. The Japanese infantry used these pauses in enemy fire to press forward under cover of their own machine gun fire. Russian troops began to panic. Officers tried to organize counterattacks, but the chaos turned into a complete rout. Fleeing Russian soldiers burned supplies and looted vodka stores. A colonel who would later lead the Whites in the Russian Civil War described the disaster. Individual soldiers, sometimes in small groups, then scattering again, helplessly looked for a way out of the trap. The whole field, as far as the eye could see, was littered with abandoned boxers and heaps of luggage. Wagons and carts, ambulances, and riderless horses all rushed about in different directions. For the first time in the war, I saw panic. Despite the catastrophe, the Russian commander managed to organize a rearguard that prevented total defeat. The fighting had been brutal, and the Japanese were too exhausted to pursue the weakened Russians. The Japanese had won, but most of the Russian army had escaped, and Japanese casualties were an unsustainable 25%. The Battle of Mukden was likely the largest in history up to that point in terms of troop numbers and ammunition expended. The Japanese fired as much ammunition at Mukden as the entire German army used in the 6-month Franco-Prussian War, and the Russians used even more. The Japanese were victorious again, but the land war had turned into a meat grinder. They couldn't continue much longer. It was up to the Navy to deliver the decisive victory Japan desperately needed. The voyage of the Russian Baltic Fleet had taken it around the world. But by the time it reached the war zone in May 1905, it was in terrible condition. The 29,000-kilometer journey had seen the fleet accidentally fire on British fishing, face mutinies, struggle with refueling problems, and suffer constant mechanical breakdowns. Its commander, Admiral Medok Rozdesvensky, referred to some of his older ships as self-sinkers. The Japanese fleet was about the Russians' journey and used the time to make repairs and train intensively. Admiral Togo planned to ambush the Russian ships as they passed through the 50-kilometer-wide Tsushima, straight on their way to Vladimir. Torpedo boats would harass the Russians at night, and the main fleet would strike the next day. When the Japanese spotted the Russian fleet early on May 27, the sea was too rough for torpedo boats, so it would be an all-or-nothing attack with the main fleet. That afternoon, the Japanese fleet centered on 4 battleships. 8 armored cruisers and 4 protected cruisers crossed in front of the Russian force and performed a bold duty for Admiral Akiyama. This was the culmination of years of preparation. The Navy had been built up through many years of painstaking work, but it all came to a head in a mere 30-minute maneuver. The decade I spent training in tactics and strategy was all for the sake of those 30 minutes. It could not have happened without a decade of preparation, so we could think of it as a decade-long war. The Japanese ships steamed obliquely towards the leading Russian vessels and opened fire on the battleships. Both sides scored hits, and Togo's flagship was badly damaged. The Russians had heavier guns, but the Japanese had superior rate of fire and better fire control. The angle of attack also meant the Russians could only fire from their forward turrets, while the Japanese could fire full broadsides using all available guns. The effect was devastating. Admiral Rozdesvensky later described the carnage. The paint burnt with clear flame on steel surfaces. Boats, ropes, hammocks, and woodwork caught fire. Cartridges and ready racks ignited. Upper works and light guns were swept away. Turrets jammed. In the first hour of battle, the Russian flagship was hit and Rozdestvensky wounded. Shortly afterwards, Japanese shells sank the battleship Oslebia, the first modern ship ever sunk by gunnery alone. A Russian sailor on a nearby destroyer watched his comrade's abandoned ship, The whole starboard side as far as the keel was laid bare. Her bright plating looked like wet scales of some sea monster. Suddenly, as if by command, all the men who had crowded to the starboard side jumped down upon these scales. Most were dashed against the built keel and fell crippled into the sea. In the water they formed an unimaginable mass, and enemy shells never ceased bursting over them. A few more seconds, and the Oslea disappeared beneath the water. The battleship Alexander III charged the Japanese line with all guns blazing, bringing temporary relief for the hard-pressed Russians. At 7 in the evening, the battle resumed, and damaged Russian ships were easy prey. The Japanese sank the Alexander III, then the battleship Borodino. As night fell, Togo sent in his torpedo boats. The next morning, only 2 Russian battleships remained, and the Japanese had surrounded the remnants of the Baltic fleet. With no hope of reaching Vladivostok, the Russian fleet surrendered. The Japanese victory at Tsushima was absolutely staggering. 34 of 38 Russian ships were sunk, captured, or interned in neutral ports, including all the battleships. About 5,000 Russian sailors were killed. Japanese losses were 3 torpedo boats and 110 dead. The Russian Navy was finished, and Tsar Nicholas II agreed to negotiate peace terms. The United States mediated peace talks in New Hampshire, with President Teddy Roosevelt heavily involved. Both sides needed to end the war quickly. Japan was victorious, but militarily exhausted, while revolutionary unrest was brewing in Russia. Japanese troops occupied Sakhalin Island in July to pressure the Russians, while Russia sent fresh divisions to Manchuria to pressure the Japanese. Eventually, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed on September 5, 1905. Russia would withdraw from Manchuria and the Liap Peninsula and grant most railway concessions to Japan. South Sakhalin would remain Japanese, while Russia recognized Japanese dominance over nominally independent Korea. However, Russia refused to pay a war indemnity to no bankrupt Japan. President Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, with a citation referring to Japan as one of the world's great powers. In Japan, shock at the supposedly lenient treaty led to riots and martial law. But the public was unaware of how tenuous the Japanese position had become. The treaty wasn't as controversial in Russia, but the defeat strengthened opposition to the autocratic regime and helped spark the 1905 revolution that nearly toppled the Tsar. The Russo-Japanese War was incredibly deadly. About 50,000 Russian and 80,000 Japanese soldiers died in combat or from disease. It also had a global impact, earning the nickname World War Z. Colonized peoples took inspiration from Japan's defeat of a European power. While Western military observers noted the destructive power of modern weapons like the machine gun, the war weakened Russia, made Japan into a major power, and caused some to conclude that modern wars could be won relatively quickly and decisively, developments that would cast a long shadow in the years leading to 1914. Now, you might think that was enough warfare for one decade, but you'd be wrong, because just as the dust was settling from the Russo-Japanese War, another conflict was brewing that would push Europe even closer to the brink of catastrophe. Mass use of artillery grinding strategic stalemate, the first use of combat aircraft and naval operations in dangerous straits. I'm not talking about the First World War, but a war just before it that marked a major turning point in European politics and military history. It destabilized the Balkans and moved the great powers further down the road of rivalry, distrust, and militarization. It's the Italo-Turkish War of 1911, 1912, and it would prove to be another crucial step on the road to Armageddon. Following Italian unification in 1871, nationalist movements continued calling for further expansion. Under the banner of New Italy, nationalists dreamed of reconstituting the Roman Empire through imperial expansion in the Mediterranean. But it was Britain and France who ended up expanding their influence in the region during the late 19th century. Italian imperialists watched with dismay in 1882 as France took control of Tunisia and Britain occupied Egypt. The Moroccan crisis of summer 1911 was a clear sign that imperial competition in the Mediterranean was still alive and well. This left Ottoman Libya as the one viable Italian target in North Africa, and some Italians worried the French or British might take it before they had the chance. Italy did expand its soft power through banks, schools, and hospitals in Libya, but diplomats called for military action. Libya is necessary to Italy for the Mediterranean balance. We could wait if there were not the danger that we might lose it. And indeed, we waited patiently until such danger appeared on the horizon. Today, this danger begins to take shape, and with the passage of time, it will grow more severe. Thus, the occupation of Libya imposes itself upon us as an unavoidable necessity. The Ottomans knew about Italy's ambitions and tried to avoid the worst by granting economic concessions. But these offers could unhide the empire's weakness. It had suffered decades of economic and military decline, plus political divisions caused by the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 and a failed counter-coup by the Sultan in 1909. The Ottoman minister to Rome understood that negotiations with Italy were unlikely to succeed. The concessions we make to the Italians in our African provinces will do nothing but increase their appetite and offer them occasion to intervene. Italian appetite is not satiable, and whatever concessions will be fatally followed by others. In this way, the sacrifices we might undertake will represent only temporary satisfactions without lasting effects. With tensions rising in 1911, Italian Prime Minister Giolitti and Foreign Minister Di San Giuliano went on a public relations offensive to win nationalist support. The press reported on supposed Ottoman insults to Italian commercial interests and citizens in Libya, which were grossly exaggerated. Giolitti, though, was still cautious. The nationalists imagined that Libya is the territory of a poor black simpleton whom a European state can dethrone as he wishes. But Libya is a province of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire is a great European power. Despite his hesitations, Giolitti felt he was running out of time. Not only was there danger of British or French action, but Italy's allies were against weakening the Ottomans. Austria-Hungary wanted stability in the Balkans, and Germany wanted a strong Ottoman Empire in case of war with so the Italian government struck a deal with France. France wouldn't interfere in Libya, and Italy wouldn't interfere in Tunisia and Morocco. Meanwhile, the Ottomans had actually moved troops away from Libya to deal with the rebellion in Yemen, though they did bring in weapons to arm local fighters in Libya in anticipation of the coming conflict. On September 27, 1911, Giolitti gave the Ottomans an ultimatum based on supposed bias against Italian business interests. Agree to Italian occupation of Libya within 24 hours or face military action. So Italy had thrown down the gauntlet in its quest for imperial glory. The Ottoman government offered further concessions, but the Italians rejected them, and the ultimatum expired on September 28th. It would be war. The Italo-Turkish War began with a somewhat reluctant-sounding announcement from Giolitti. The Italian government, therefore, finding itself forced to safeguard its dignity and its interests, has decided to proceed to the military occupation of Libya. This solution is the only one which Italy can accept. The Italian military now had to arrange an invasion on extremely short notice, since they weren't fully aware of government plans until September. All the same, between October 3rd and 21st, 1911, 25,000 Italian troops landed along the coast and captured Tripoli, Tobruk, Berna, Benghazi, and Homs. At first, Ottoman resistance was generally light, since they were outgunned and outnumbered. The Italian landings had been successful, but advancing into the Libyan interior would prove far more difficult. The Italians knew so little about the region that some planning documents even used ancient sources like Caesar for topographic and demographic information. Italian leaders hoped that by seizing the coastal towns, they could force the Ottomans to surrender. Instead, the Ottomans simply withdrew in good order beyond the range of Italian naval guns. As one Italian soldier wrote, "The invasion barely seemed to be a war at all. I believe that it is not real war, but little attacks, and soon we shall overcome." Overall, I'm very happy, and you'll see that it will be finished very soon. He was killed in action just 6 days later. One factor the Italian plan hadn't taken into account was the local Arab population. Italian planners assumed the Arabs would welcome them as liberators from Ottoman oppression, and did. You didn't expect local resistance, which turned out to be a massive mistake. By late October, the Italians were feeling confident. They'd captured the coast, and the Ottomans had seemingly fled the field. But instead of capitulating as the Italians expected, the Ottomans and Arabs made common cause. Militarily, the Italians seemed to be in a strong position. Their conscripts brought modern equipment, including gray-green uniforms and magazine rifles. Both would continue in service until 1945. The Italians also had support from large naval guns offshore, plus machine guns and German-built artillery. Estimates on Ottoman troop numbers vary greatly. There were probably somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 Ottoman regulars and 20,000 to 35,000 Arab tribesmen under local sheiks. They had German artillery, but no heavy naval guns for support. Interestingly, their rifles were considered superior to the Italian weapons because of their larger caliber. A British doctor with the Turkish Red Crescent explained why. The injuries produced by the small conical bullets used by the Italians were scarcely ever severe, and if the wounds had not been infected, we had the satisfaction of soon sending our Arab patients back to their duties in the field. Ottoman forces identified what they felt was a weakness in the fortified Italian line near Tripoli. Italian trenches in this area didn't run through the usual but directly through an oasis, which could provide cover for advancing Ottoman troops. Additionally, the Italians hadn't built many fortifications around the settlement of Shar al-Shah. On October 23rd, supported by diversionary attacks to the south, Ottoman forces attacked a 6-kilometer stretch of front between Forts Sida Messeri and the sea. Around 1,800 men of the Italian 11th Regiment were awakened at 7 in the morning by the sound of gunfire and dogs barking. As the Italians scrambled to man their positions, local Arabs came out of Shar al-Shat and attacked them from behind. One Italian soldier recalled the shock. "The Arabs seemed to rise out of the earth on every side of us. Italian reinforcements arrived late and eventually beat back the Ottomans. But Italian losses were heavy. At least 21 officers and 482 men were killed, including 250 who were massacred in a cemetery after they'd surrendered. Some of the bodies had been mutilated. Officially, the Italian General Staff downplayed the setback. Our losses were not light, but justified by the result, and showed that the morale of our troops was excellent. The Italian response on the ground was swift and brutal. They executed around 4,000 Arabs by firing squad in the following days. The Battle of Shar al-Shat caused the Italian government to increase the expeditionary force to 100,000 men, far more than planned. Giolitti also escalated the war politically and announced the full annexation of Libya on November 5th. This was mostly symbolic, since the Italians only controlled the coast, but it virtually assured the war would continue. Charles-Château was a major psychological blow for Italy. They'd held their position, but it showed the war wouldn't be as quick as they'd hoped. By late fall 1911, the Italo-Turkish War had ground to a stalemate. The Ottomans couldn't expel the Italians, but the Italians could enforce a decisive battle because the Ottomans and Arabs began waging a full guerrilla war. Italian naval supremacy meant the Turks couldn't send reinforcements, but they did manage to sneak in shipments of arms and a small group of volunteer officers, including Enver Bey and Mustafa Kemal. Kemal made it to Libya by sailing to Egypt on a Russian ship while disguised as a journalist. Despite previous struggles between Arab tribes and the Ottomans, the two now worked together against the Italian invaders. Ottoman commander Enver Bey and tribal leader Sheikh Omar al-Muqta committed to guerrilla strategy, keep the Italians pinned in coastal towns, and exhaust them through attrition. Kemal, who was wounded in the eye, operated in the Derna sector and used his 9,000 men to keep 15,000 Italians busy. The Ottomans wanted to continue dominating the Arabs, but also saw much value in their allies. As Enver Bey expressed, "I have become master of the situation. Into my hands has fallen a power, a force for which various powers of Europe, the Italians, the French, the English spent millions to have in their hands. And thus, this force has come to me without my spending a dime." Arab leader Farhat al-Zave made the somewhat different Arab motivations clear to a French reporter. "Our men are patriots in bare feet and rags, like your soldiers of the revolution, and not religious fanatics. If the Turkish government abandons us, we will proclaim that it has forfeited its right over our country. We will form the Republic of Libya." Italian commanders wanted to push into the desert, but they lacked intelligence and logistics, had poor desert equipment, and were vulnerable to guerrillas. So instead they advanced little by little, digging trenches as they went, sometimes every 100 meters. One British journalist called it purely In December, the Italians tried to bring the Turks and Arabs to a decisive battle at Ain Zara, an Ottoman base on high ground with commanding views around Tripoli. The Italian attack opened on December 4th, with around 15,000 men, supported by heavy artillery and naval guns, to assault columns advanced on rudimentary Ottoman trenches, with one running into difficulty. The defenders were forced to abandon the trenches and were then hit hard in the open by Italian artillery fire. The Ottomans withdrew 40 kilometers south, but Italian cavalry failed to surround them. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!